Hey, welcome back everyone. First off, some breaking news. A 400-year-old bridge was destroyed by the floods in Shanxi Town in Anhui, China, and this bridge had been built during the Ming Dynasty. The destruction of the second largest stone arch bridge in the region was one of the latest scenes in the ongoing floods in 26 provinces and cities in China. And this is in addition to the collapsed roads, destroyed homes, and other forms of disaster in other parts of China that have been seeing these rains. Locals have attempted to carry on with life as usual to the extent that they're able to. In Anhui, students taking their college entrance exams were seen taking a boat to the examination hall. One of the local officials announced that of the 2,000 students who were eligible for the exam, only about 500 arrived. Meanwhile, the Three Gorges Dam still appears to be holding, yet water discharge from the dam, remember they opened up these different flood valves, has made flooding along the Yangtze River even more severe. The heavy rains have continued for more than 30 days. Local authorities in some areas are predicting it will go on for 35 days. Cities downstream have been heavily affected by these floods, and reports say that in Shanghai it has become like a sea. Meanwhile, there's a tragic scene in Anshan, Guizhou, where a bus carrying students to their college entrance exams made a sudden turn, smashed through a road fence, and crashed into the HuangShan reservoir where it sank instantly. 21 people were killed, 36 were rescued, 15 were injured, but it's still unclear how many were on board. Now, it's unclear exactly what happened that led to the crash. If you watch the video, you can see the driver appeared to make a sudden turn. And the scene of that was similar to another bus crash in China that happened back in November 2018. A driver became angry at a female passenger who had hit him with a shoe, and he then intentionally drove the bus off a bridge, killing 15 people on board. Videos of that show the woman attacking the bus driver getting angry, then rapidly turning the wheel and driving off a bridge. Now in China, incidents like these bus crashes, when it's done intentionally, it's not clear if this latest one was done intentionally, but previous ones were done intentionally. These are being interpreted, not just in China but around the world, as symptoms of the Chinese Communist Party's destruction of moral values. You might have seen some of the horrific footage, for example, of cars running over little kids playing on the street, backing up over them sometimes, because many people in China, many of these drivers, believe that killing the person they hit with their cars is less risky, less costly than having to deal with medical payments. What happens when you destroy a person's willingness to care for the lives of others? It is an absolute egalitarian society. It is the end state of the communist system where you have successfully destroyed morality. And it ties into the idea of what happens when a communist system reaches that end state, when all the lofty ideals they used to promote it at the beginning go out the window, and people no longer care about human life, when there's disregard for human life. And meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has put new controls in place to regulate the abilities of government workers to obtain citizenship or residency in foreign countries. It is restricting the ability of government workers to leave China, in other words. It laid out 6 categories of government workers who can now face punishment if they hold foreign residence or foreign nationality, and people who violate it risk having their pays cut or risk losing their jobs. The new law affects civil employees, people in public affairs, managers of state-owned companies, managers in various institutions in education, research, and elsewhere, managers in certain types of government organizations. Now, locally in China, this move that restricts the ability of Chinese to leave China is being interpreted as being targeted at the general public. They're broad enough so they could affect most government workers. But of course, high-ranking officials and their families are not being included in these restrictions. And now in China, things like this are interpreted as the Chinese Communist Party giving, say, special privileges to itself while persecuting anyone beneath it. And so with this law, for example, these new restrictions, this applies not just to, say, low-level government officials, but even mid-level government officials, where they can face punishment by the Chinese Communist Party if they want to get foreign citizenship. In other words, if they try to leave the country. And this is in the context of things like in Hong Kong, where people are trying to escape, where, for example, the United Kingdom is offering a path to citizenship, or at least talking about it, for people looking to escape, and where the Chinese Communist Party is threatening the UK for talking about that. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party does not want its own people to leave the country. This is being interpreted as just another chapter of the Chinese Communist Party's totalitarian nature and of this oligarchy, this high-ranking system of high-level politicians who have no regard for their own people and who regard themselves as a separate class of citizens. So first off, CCP officials are being told to prepare for a global crisis on many fronts, including tensions with the U.S., food shortages, currency wars, other things will go into it. Now, Zhou Li, the former deputy minister of the CCP's Central Liaison Department, tied to its political warfare programs, recently issued an article in China Social Science News stating this, quote, "The Party Central Committee demands that our leading cadres at all levels should adhere to the bottom line thinking and make a long-term ideological preparation and work preparation for responding to changes in the external environment." And I'll be explaining this a bit more, so hang in there with me. Now it tells them to, quote, "pay special attention to the world, the different issues taking place right now and in the future, and to see, quote, the essence of what is taking place, and to think from a, quote, strategic perspective on how to carry out active prevention and also countermeasures before the incident, while it happens, and after it takes place." Now it lists 6 different incidents taking place in the world right now and demands preparation for these. First of these, it states, quote, "it is necessary to make preparations for the deterioration of Sino-US relations," in other words, full escalation with the United States. It then says, quote, "we must make preparations to cope with the shrinking external demand and disruption of the industrial and supply chains," talking about the Chinese economy. It then warns about the need to prepare for the long-term spread of the new coronavirus. It then goes into, quote, "we must make preparations for getting rid of dollar hegemony and gradually decoupling the renminbi from the dollar." In other words, engaging in currency wars with the United States and also against the US dollar itself. It then states to, quote, "prepare for the global food crisis." And of course, there have been a lot of rumors about food shortages in China, and it says food production globally is expected to drop by 30%. And last of all, it says, quote, "we must make preparations for the resurgence of international counterterrorism forces." So let's go into this, exactly what this means. It talks about the breaking of US-China relations, and it talks about some of the different things Trump is doing to China, for example, putting in different sanctions against Chinese Communist Party leaders. Just among these, for example, the United States is putting sanctions on individuals in China who've been involved with passing these national security laws in Hong Kong. They're talking about putting sanctions on Chinese officials who have engaged in the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs. This is in addition to many, many other areas of economic sanctions, different things done in response to the CCP's handling of the virus, and so on. Not to mention pulling companies out of China, not just from the US, but other countries. And so what does this mean? The Chinese Communist Party regards this as one of the top 6 strategic issues going forward. And they're already talking about preparing countermeasures for dealing with the issue as it currently stands, and also for the trajectory of where it is heading. They see the United States and China decoupling. They see this coming, say, down the road, and they're preparing for it. And also these different officials are preparing for they themselves getting called out for possibly engaging in human rights abuses, such as they are right now with Hong Kong and with Xinjiang and the Muslim Uyghurs. Also talks about Chinese economic downturn. And this is going to be important as we go into the next story, because the Chinese Communist Party is talking internally about economic downturn, how their economy is struggling. They can't get it back up and running, but they're telling foreign investors that the economy is ready to boom. And so a lot of foreign investors are putting their money into China right now. Now, based on the CCP's own internal analysis, that does not seem to be the case. But they're using different methods to lure investors into China, and based on this document, we can understand this is part of their strategy right now. They also talk about the pandemic, and notably in this, they don't seem to see the pandemic going away. They're talking about preparing for the lingering nature of the pandemic as time goes forward. And they talk about currency wars. You remember we talked about US-China currency wars going back several years now, a long time now. In fact, Trump's advisor on China, Peter Navarro, was one of the big names calling out the Chinese Communist Party's different forms of currency war. He did that book and documentary called Death by China, which talks about this. The CCP is talking about reviving that battle. And food shortages, of course. What's happening in China right now? Even during the time of this pandemic, even the time of the CCP virus spreading in China, There were rumors internally in China of possible food shortages. In addition to that, now they have locusts. Now they have natural disasters. They have floods in 26 different provinces and cities of China. They also have different issues, for example, such as the swine flu, such as the avian flu. And already before all of this, they had relinquished their policies for grain self-sufficiency, going back several years now, to focus on poultry and to focus on pork. And now all of these are being destabilized. They're talking about food shortages. And also the resurgence of terrorism. The CCP is looking at this as also something on the horizon. And so these are the different battlegrounds in terms of political warfare for the CCP going forward, and also areas that we should keep an eye on. Now moving on, the Chinese Communist Party is urging investors to return to the Chinese market, and this is being done amidst mixed responses, some of them politicized, saying it's an example of Trump's failing China strategy because the CCP is claiming that its economy is coming back, and also to warnings at the same time of a possible financial bust in China, given previous examples of exactly what is taking place right now. So let me explain. Now, the Financial Times reported, quote, China's stock market recorded its biggest rally in more than a year on Monday after state media encouraged investors to pile into the market and reap the benefits of a post-coronavirus economic boom. In other words, it's the CCP media promoting this. Now, it notes the Chinese state media have been pushing for investors and have included headlines such as from the state-owned Shanghai Securities News stating this, quote, ha 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 ha. The signs of a bull market are more and more clear. That's an actual headline in one of their news outlets. Now, several news outlets and organizations have gotten behind the idea of China's market rebound, and they've been using this both to promote the CCP and to attack Trump's tough policies on China as having failed. A Bloomberg opinion piece from Zhou Li stated, quote, Dear China, enjoy this bull market, love Donald, and said, quote, millions of Chinese investors, defiant and patriotic, are once again engineering a fast and furious bull market on the home turf. So again, Chinese investors, millions of Chinese investors, and they're talking about it as them orchestrating this whole movement. Also, Deutsche Bank is saying China will have a V-shaped recovery, and it says it may cool after the second half of 2020, but claims domestic demand has, quote, largely recovered. Now, Deutsche Bank has its own China connection. It's been promoting the idea of a, quote, very impressive economic recovery for China, but claims also at the same time that America is standing in the way of China's recovery. Now, just last year alone, the bank became one of the first to join China's network for e-commerce payments, received approval for China's most comprehensive license for foreign banks to underwrite in the bond market, and was also appointed as a depository bank for medical treatment centers in China, among other different offers it received. In April 2020, the Chinese Communist Party also began giving access to global banks for its capital markets and began letting them have ownership of joint ventures. Again, as it began very likely anticipating this different, say, economic hit it would take from the virus, and began making changes to lure banks like this and others into China. Now, among those given access were Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan Securities, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and many others. Yet the move doesn't come without its red flags in terms of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing right now. While U.S. reports are claiming the Chinese market has a rebound, the warning to Chinese Communist Party officials themselves states this, quote, the orders of our foreign trade export enterprises have been greatly reduced, the production of upstream and downstream enterprises has stalled, and international transportation logistics have been blocked. The phenomena of unavailability of raw materials and unavailability of products has surged, which has put tremendous pressure on our steady growth and employment. That is an absolute contradiction to what it's telling the rest of the world, and an absolute contradiction with what a lot of these investors are going into China believing that they're being given. That is an absolute contradiction to the situation they're being told right now. Now, facing this internal situation outlined by these Chinese Communist Party officials themselves on the difficult situation of the Chinese economy, they're telling a different narrative to the outside world. Part of this is being done through a propaganda campaign from its state-run media. Financial Times reported on this, and this is being done to call for investment in China. And as Bloomberg News reported, although their article was more favorable to the CCP, there's also an effort to rally, quote, millions of Chinese investors. And the CCP launched several initiatives for foreign investment, which many international financial institutions have been granted access to, as we noted with Deutsche Bank and these other organizations. And even according to Western analysis, the investment drive to China is taking place on shaky grounds. The Financial Times reported this, quote, "The chorus of support for China's markets rekindled memories of 2014 and 2015, when state media cheered a more than doubling of stock prices." In other words, state media were saying a very similar thing. And it continues stating this, "The rally later unwound in spectacular fashion with a 40% collapse." And this is in addition to the overall untrustworthy nature of the CCP's official numbers on its economy. A lot of different Chinese dissidents say the Chinese economy is basically a Ponzi scheme. They have set numbers of economic rise every year. And so a lot of people know they cannot trust the Chinese Communist Party's numbers, especially at a time like this, when it's part of their national strategic interests, and the CCP itself is facing massive crisis, to such an extent they're telling local officials to prepare for it. Now, just as a few examples of this, the Chinese Communist Party was recently caught having fake gold reserves, which meant that close to 4% of its financial reserves may also be fake. And internal interviews being done on the ground in China, of course, were blacklisted in China, but Epoch Times does get interviews there over the phone and from sources we have there. They're pointing to slow recovery, factories that are opened yet not producing, and to an uncertain future amid a flurry of natural disasters and looming crisis in China. Now moving on, in addition to some of the recent news that the bubonic plague, the Black Death, has emerged in China, and a new type of swine flu in China that has a, quote, pandemic potential, the New York Times is reporting that 239 experts are claiming the new coronavirus is airborne, which goes against what the, say, WHO has been telling us. The New York Times says this, quote, "The coronavirus is finding new victims worldwide in bars and restaurants, offices, markets, and casinos, giving rise to frightening clusters of infection that increasingly confirm what many scientists have been saying for months. The virus lingers in the air indoors, infecting those nearby." The article warns against indoor spaces, including schools, nursing homes, residences, businesses, etc. And it says that poor ventilation, for example, may be a problem with this, and recommends ultraviolet light may be needed to kill the viral particles. Now, it cites an open letter to the WHO from 239 scientists in 32 countries who have done research showing smaller particles can infect people, and they're asking the WHO to change its recommendations based on their findings. And it notes that this contradicts reporting from the WHO. Now again, this contradicts what the WHO has been telling us. It has been claiming the virus is spread mainly through respiratory droplets from people, and these quickly fall to the floor after going out. And now, when it comes to the bigger picture of this, if the WHO revises its recommendations to say the virus is airborne, rather say sent from person to person, this will very likely be used to keep the lockdowns in place in many areas. Because one of the big arguments right now, for example, in New York City, against, say, opening up indoor dining, we have outdoor dining, for example, allowed right now. The argument against opening indoor dining, opening schools, opening a lot of businesses, is the idea that indoor environments can cause the virus to spread more easily. And this has become a political issue. A lot of conservatives believe this is being done, say, by big politics, big government, and this is just part of their plan right now in terms of what they're doing. A lot of Democrats do believe what they're being told when it comes to this being a serious danger, and of course it's based on these different studies like this. Now what is the actual situation? To be honest, I don't know. Data is all over the place when it comes to this. We'll have to see how accurate this is. We've seen many times, for example, that different research coming out gets proven false when it comes to this virus. Some things that were said early on do later prove to be true. So it's unclear what is the true situation right now. We'll be keeping you updated as we find more information. Now moving on, Wuhan, which is the epicenter of this virus, has raised its flood alert level as heavy rains continue in China. Now there are still floods in 26 provinces and cities in China, and they're looking now at more than 30 days of ongoing rain, somewhere around 35 days in some parts. And this is becoming a very serious issue in many areas of China. They're facing many natural disasters, not just these floods, but also earthquakes, locusts, hail, tornadoes. I mean, you name it, they're facing it right now. The situation in China is very rough. The floods seem to be causing more damage than anything currently. But when you combine it with the other natural disasters, you're looking at about double the amount of damage from just the floods. And also, Uyghur exiles filed a complaint with the International Criminal Court to accuse the Chinese Communist Party of genocide. Now, we'll see whether the Chinese Communist Party recognizes this, but in terms of calling out the CCP for its human rights abuses, This is a major step. As I've mentioned previously, the Chinese Communist Party has a glass jaw. As powerful as it makes itself look to the world, as much as it tries to threaten other countries, it has a glass jaw. It is a paper tiger, and its weak point is this: ideology. It is the reason why the Chinese Communist Party censors its internet. It's the reason why it will not allow open discussion in China. It's the reason why if you go to Tiananmen Square in Beijing and you unfurl a banner calling out the Chinese regime's human rights abuses, you will be arrested. It is why if you're a journalist in China and you start mentioning its different human rights abuses, you will very likely lose your visa. The Chinese Communist Party cannot stand the light of day when it comes to its human rights abuses, and these are its weakest point. This is the information it tries to prevent the Chinese people from knowing about. The different abuses it has carried out against its own people and continues to carry out against its own people. As soon as there is enough international pressure on this, it's very unlikely the Chinese Communist Party will be able to keep this information from its own people. And that is what it fears more than anything, at least in my analysis. Also, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is saying that President Trump is planning a new series of executive orders on China, aiming at bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, working on immigration issues, and also affecting prescription drug prices. All fronts of this, again, targeting China. Now, he told Fox and Friends,
so you just need to stay tuned, because starting this week, you'll see executive orders, you'll see business that actually goes forward from the Oval Office when Congress doesn't act.
And so in other words, this U.S.-China ideological battle, this trade war, which is moving to this whole-of-nation action against the Chinese Communist Party and its whole-of-nation strategy against the United States. This is still moving forward. Now we'll have to see what this means for investors who have been pouring their money back into China. If the United States puts additional sanctions on China, they're talking about many different layers of it now. 1 on the virus, 2 on, say, Hong Kong, 3 on Xinjiang, and this one now, who knows on what. And also against some of the major Chinese companies, including Huawei, including the CCP's high-tech industries. While investors are pouring their money back into China, at least according to some of these surface reports, there are looming sanctions on the Chinese Communist Party that could really, really impact things. And also the Chinese Communist Party's Confucius Institutes, they are rebranding themselves with a new name. They're now calling them Centers for Language Exchange and Cooperation. Now this is happening as different countries are pushing them out. Sweden just got rid of their last one. Canada was actually in the forefront of going against these Confucius Institutes and trying to get them out of the country. This is a major discussion in many countries, including Australia. In the United States, this is one of the issues on the forefront, but there are still many of them in the U.S. currently. And so what are these Confucius Institutes, which are now called these Centers for Language Exchange and Cooperation? These are Chinese Communist Party programs to export its different narratives on the Chinese Communist Party and to indoctrinate would-be Chinese linguists on this narrative. And so in other words, people who've been educated in the system, not just in universities, but also in different school systems where they get money from the Chinese Communist Party to run these programs. The CCP pays the schools to run these programs in their schools. It means that people who learn Chinese, who go on to work in government, who go on to work in business, who go on to work in different areas of the U.S., have been indoctrinated with the CCP's worldview on China. And they will promote, to some extent, very likely if the plan works out for the CCP's agendas within those institutions. They will have based their education on the Chinese Communist Party's narratives meant for the outside world. They will support its interests using international institutions. Now, they're being banned on a large scale in many countries, and again, facing this pressure, the CCP has decided to give them a new name, the Centers for Language Exchange and Cooperation. That said, folks, we're again broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And also, if you're on YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really need your help supporting this channel. And also, if you want to show your support, you can join our Patreon channel, join our Crossroads team. And from there, also, every Sunday, I do a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. Of course, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay free.